Hi everybody, this is Marlene with Eerie News, and today is January 18th, 2025, Saturday, January 18th, 2025. Incredible to believe that we are now at the first quarter of this 21st century, but here we are. And for those of you who hear unusual noises in the background, I have a lot of exotics, and it's the middle of the day, and because of the weather here, it's very cold. They're inside. We have a little corner for them, so if you hear some unusual noises, that's them in the background. But anyway, let's get off to our first story, which is out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, and it's titled The Ghost of Shooter's Hill. Shooter's Hill is the highest point in South London. The area was in use since the Roman times. In 1838, skeletons and Roman coins were unearthed in the area belonging to Roman soldiers. The road that runs from Dover to London traverses Shooter's Hill, and it was a favorite place for highwaymen to rob the unwary traveler. It comes as no surprise that it has its fair share of ghost stories, including a white lady. Reference to Shooter's Hill was recorded as far back as 1226, not only for its elevated height, but for the use of archers, possibly connected to it being used by criminals even then. The area was developed in the 18th century, and many fine houses were built there, however few, if any, of them remain. In the 20th century, the woodland was threatened by suburban housing developments. Fortunately, the London County Council purchased several tracts to maintain them as public open spaces in the 1920s and 1930s. The following stories predate the suburban sprawl, and it was still a thickly wooded, isolated spot. Elliot O'Donnell included it in his book Case Book of Ghosts. Quote, at Shooter's Hill in the late 1830s, people passing by a certain spot in the neighborhood at night reported hearing unaccountable noises and occasionally seeing the phantom of a woman in a white dress gliding about the grounds. She was always spoken of as the White Lady. Not one of the witnesses was seriously believed. End quote. This changed after the newspaper The Guardian ran the following article dated January 26, 1844. Quote, a discovery was made on Blackheath on Saturday last, indicating the commission of the deed of darkness, which will probably, from the long time that must have since elapsed, remain forever buried in oblivion. At about 30 yards from the high road leading to Shooter's Hill, a laborer employed upon some improvements making upon the heath by the resident gentleman came upon some bones. He made known the circumstance to some persons near, and proceeding cautiously in his search discovered an entire skeleton. It was of the usual stature, indicating a young person, but all doubt on this hand was speedily removed by finding the hair perfect, of a light gold color, of great length, and beautifully braided. At the back of the head was a deep, distinct fracture, of a circular form, though irregular, the skull being quite beaten in. These circumstances seem clearly to indicate a murder, particularly as the remains were at no greater depth than was committed must be considerable, as not the slightest remains except the bones and hair could be discovered. End quote. The mystery deepened even more several days later. Another story was printed with the following quote, a few days ago the skeleton of a female about 25 years of age, with the hair beautifully braided and a large fracture in the back of the skull was discovered on Blackheath, near the foot of Shooter's Hill, and that day the skeleton of a child about 10 years of age has been found on the same spot. The skull of the latter was much broken and decayed. A heavy piece of iron, apparently part of a mortar shell, was also found. It was at first supposed that the bodies had been murdered by highwaymen, but from the depth of earth and regularity of interment, it is now supposed that robbers would not have remained long enough to bury them in such a manner. End quote. Now, the story continues. Elliot O'Donnell continues in retelling the story of what was discovered on that day. Quote, but the unfortunate woman's ghost still lingered on. While living in St. John's Square, Blackheath, in 1898, I met several people who remembered the subsequent reappearance of it. One was Mr. Eric Johnson, a man of independent means, then staying in Lewisham. As a boy, he told me he remembered the following incident being frequently narrated by his father, usually when they had friends to the house. To be brief, Mr. Johnson Sr. On his way home one night was walking down Shooter's Hill, which at that time was still a very lonely and deserted locality after dusk, when he heard a cry of such terror and despair that he stopped at once. While he stood listening, the cry was repeated, seeming to come from a spot close at hand. He called out, but there was no reply. Then, after an interval of a minute or so, the cry was repeated, and a woman in white dress rose from the ground, some little way ahead of him. The moonlight being, so it seemed, focused on her, he was able to see her very distinctly, and thinking she was ill and wanted assistance, he ran towards her. To his intense surprise, however, when he was within a few yards of her, she vanished. There was nothing in sight to afford cover, so she could not have hidden. To Mr. Johnson, greatly wondering, resumed his walk home, but he had not covered many more yards before he heard the same cry again, this time very close at hand. Although by no means a timid man, he was now thoroughly frightened, being convinced that what he had heard and seen was nothing earthly. And fearing that if he delayed he might see the figure again, he ran the rest of the way home. Mr. Johnson had not heard of the haunting prior to this, and so was very relieved to learn that the phantom he had seen had been seen by others. He never, his son added, passed the place again at night alone. End quote. Almost 30 years later, in April 1871, another story appeared in the local paper detailing a gruesome crime where the lady in white haunted, and where the skeleton with the blonde braids was found. Quote, the young woman who before daybreak on Wednesday morning was found barbarously wounded about the head, apparently with a hatchet, on lonely Kidbrook Lane on Altham Moor and in Guy's Hospital, is sinking fast. The grassy road is a long, narrow, unfrequented byway, running from the back of Shooter's Hill, Woolwich Road, to Blackheath, and there is not a house within a quarter of a mile from the place where she was found. The occurrence has now created immense excitement, inasmuch as she still remains unclaimed and unknown. When first found, she appeared to be unable to answer any questions, at intervals in a half-conscious state, sometimes shrieking out and crying, "Oh, Emily, don't beat me so cruelly. Don't kill me outright." At apparently lucid intervals, she had been asked who so ill used her, and she seemed to breathe the word Emily. Another alarming circumstance has occurred. The body of another young woman was found dead on Thursday in a pond at Lee, not far from Eltham. In her pocket, a number of letters were found. Some of it was stated addressed to Emily. The police were making inquiries to see if there was likely to have been any companionship between the two young women, but both cases still remain in mystery. End quote. Within a few days, the young lady died. She was later identified as 17-year-old Jane Clemson. She had been employed as a domestic servant only 2 weeks before, and it was confirmed that she was pregnant. Scotland Yard arrested the son of a respected tradesman who had employed her for over a year. His name was Edmund Pook, and he was 20 years old. Examination of Pook's clothing found blood in his trousers, and police found that he had bought a hammer shortly before the murder. Unfortunately, Pook was able to produce an alibi that he was not at Kidbrook Lane when the murder was estimated to have been committed, and he was eventually acquitted. The case remains unsolved. The murder of these two women were similar not only in how close they were, but that both of them had been killed with what seemed to be hammer or hatchet-like instrument. After the murder, Kidbrook Lane was claimed to be haunted nightly by cries, groans, and the apparition of the murdered girl. The stories were so persistent that for a long time the lane was shunned after dark. Most of old Kidbrook Lane, including the spot of the murder, is now a part of Rochester Way. And, well, a deserted place that gets a reputation for being haunted, that's not unusual in and of itself because it happens. But just the fact that 3 women, as far as they could attest, especially one that seemed that she was buried there maybe hundreds of years before, indicates that's like a very unusual thing. All these women get killed. Not only do they get killed, but the same method is used to kill them. Basically, attacking them on the head, fracturing their skull. And you even wonder, even the child, the skeleton of the child that was there, what was the story with that? And of course, no one, was it an accident? More than likely not. Or was it murder? But at the same time, the older one, the one with the braids, they took time to bury her, like in a burial. It wasn't like somebody murdered her and just put a few inches of dirt on her and that's it. But yeah. So, on to the next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction stories, and this one is titled The Palace of Grief. It was the roaring 20s. Prohibition was still in effect and Hollywood land flourished when architect Gordon Kaufman designed a lavish home for the Doheny family, which was perched above Beverly Hills. The family moved into Greystone Mansion in the fall of 1928, when it was reported as the most expensive home ever built in California. Kaufman had also built the Hoover Dam and the iconic Los Angeles Times building, and when hired by Ed Doheny Sr., who was an oil baron and a rival of John D. Rockefeller, he designed an estate that rivaled Hearst Castle at San Simeon. Ned Doheny Jr. was gifted with Greystone Mansion by his father, who lived across the street. The senior Doheny's company was the first one who struck oil in the Los Angeles area in 1892, and he spared no expense in building Greystone. The household was composed of Ned Doheny, his wife Lucy, and their 5 children, ages 3 to 14. The vast estate was staffed with 15 employees. Among the employees was Theodore Hugh Plunkett, Ned Doheny's personal secretary. On the night of February 16, 1929, he arrived at the estate and let himself in with a passkey, since he was a trusted employee. In 1913, he was hired as the couple's chauffeur. After serving in the U.S. Navy during World War I, Plunkett became the close friend and personal secretary of Ned Doheny and a trusted family aide. Ned's wife, Lucy Doheny, saw when he arrived and went to a spare bedroom supposedly for his use when he was not staying in his apartment in Hollywood. Suddenly, a single gunshot split the silence, and she quickly made her way to the mansion's east wing. What happened exactly from this point on remains a mystery until this day. Strangely, Lucy Doheny called Dr. Ernest Fishbog, the family physician, instead of the police. He hurried over from a nearby movie theater, and they went to the bedroom. Later described when agitated Plunkett, holding a gun in one hand, answered the door. Then he closed it, locked it, which was followed by another shot. According to the pair, they gained access around midnight and found both men dead, lying in a pool of their own blood. Plunkett's body was face down and spread eagle on the floor. He was wearing a pinstripe suit, and he was still clutching a cigarette. Under his body was a Bisley model .45 caliber Colt revolver. 12 feet away, Ned Doheny lay flat on his back, wearing night clothing and a robe. He had bullet wounds on both sides of his head, since the bullet went in just above his left ear and exited through the right temple. 2 hours would go by before police were called to the scene, and they found that both bodies had been moved. Suspicions grew when the statement given by the doctor and Lucy Doheny seemed to be stilted and rehearsed. Lucy Doheny said the bodies were moved when the doctor tried to resuscitate the men. 2 days later, the coroner ruled the case a murder-suicide, carried out by Hugh Plunkett after he went temporarily insane and was allegedly denied a raise by his boss. Leslie T. White, an investigator for the Los Angeles County District's Attorney's Office, had his own serious doubts as to the story given by Mrs. Doheny and Dr. Fishbog. He also questioned Lucy Doheny's brothers and brother-in-law, the servants, the night watchman, as well as Hugh's father Charles and brother Robert. And in a quote that he had about this case, he said, "The physical facts and the testimony of these witnesses do not jibe. I understand, too, that some people believe the Doheny family are too influential to tamper with." There was no inquest, and the crime was all but covered up in the press. But such a salacious situation made the front pages of all the newspapers all over the country, where Plunkett was painted as unstable and full of jealousy. However, a clear motive was never provided. At the time, Plunkett and Doheny were still under criminal investigation for the Teapot Dome bribery case, which involved the senior Doheny, and this may have played a role. Excuse me. Yeah, there's a lot of roots to this case, but let's continue. The forensic evidence pointed to another scenario. Plunkett, it appeared, was shot from behind while smoking a cigarette. Based on this scenario, Doheny shot Plunkett and then himself, not the other way around. Despite this contradiction as to the coroner's finding, the case was closed as a murder-suicide. A post-mortem examination found both men had been drinking. Doheny had powder burns around one of the bullet holes in his head. indicating the gun was no further than 3 inches away from his temple when fired. Plunkett had no burns, making it unlikely he put the .45 to his own head. The revolver had no fingerprints suggesting it had been thoroughly wiped clean. That Hugh Plunkett's life was unraveling was no mystery. His wife had gotten an uncontested divorce in October 1928, since there were indicators that he appeared to suffer from a nervous ailment which had become worse. Dr. Fishbog would go on to tell police that Plunkett's disposition had started to decline in 1927, when he suffered from severely abscessed teeth. Each time a tooth was pulled, he had a severe nervous reaction. In December 1928, he had a very painful swollen abscess over his left eye, which caused a persistent headache and a fever. Plunkett also suffered from insomnia, and he took Dial or Veronal, an over-the-counter barbiturate, in order to sleep. Fishbaugh had been attending Plunkett at the family's request. Ironically, hours before the crime, the family held a conference since Plunkett's condition had worsened as he was not following the doctor's recommendation. Ned was trying to convince him to enter a sanatorium for rest and treatment, but he refused. Was he afraid he would be diagnosed as insane and committed against his will when he wanted to leave? This undoubtedly would spare him from testifying in the Teapot Dome's case, and God knows, the Dohenyes had the money to make him disappear behind asylum walls. The newspapers, though, were not ready to let the story die down, especially with Ed Doheny's connection to the Teapot Dome scandal. Rumors swirled as whether the men were involved in more than a platonic relationship, or if perhaps it was a romantic triangle involving Ned's wife. The mystery lies in what happened before the police arrived. Several theories have arisen throughout the years. In one, Ned was the one who called the doctor to calm Hugh down. In another, the men were involved in a homosexual relationship, and Ned killed Plunkett and then himself. A third was that Lucy had killed both men. Another stressor in Plunkett's life was that he was panicking at the thought of having to testify in the Teapot Dome scandal and incriminating the Dohenyes. He had accompanied Ned Doheny when they dropped off $100,000 in the bribery case. The family had been loyal to him over the years, but they had their wealth to protect them. And in the end, he was not connected to them by blood. If they withdrew their support, what would happen to him? Within a few days of his death, Ned Doheny was laid to rest at Forest Lawn in Glendale, which is where Plunkett was buried as well. This was surprising since Ned's stepmother, Carrie Estelle Doheny, was one of the biggest contributors to the Catholic Diocese in Los Angeles. The Doheny family plot was at Calvary Cemetery, and why Ned was buried in Forest Lawn, a secular cemetery, has never been explained. Ned's own mother had taken her life in 1900 when he was 7 years old. In February 1900, 8 months before her death, Carrie Doheny filed a divorce suit against Edward Doheny for desertion. The couple had separated 10 months before. The story put out by the family and carried by the newspapers was that she swallowed a large dose of fluid used in electric batteries, mistaking it for her medicine. This had caused her to die in agony. She had been an invalid for some time and suffered from alcoholism. Her first child, Eileen, died in 1892 when she was 8 years old. Within 3 months of their divorce, Doheny Sr. married Carrie Betzold, 20 years younger than him. Was Ned Doheny buried in another cemetery because, like his mother, it was suspected he had taken his own life? Or perhaps that he was gay? The first Mrs. Doheny was originally interred at Evergreen Cemetery, but after Ned's death, Edward Sr. had her remains and those of their daughter Eileen disinterred and placed with Ned. If there was a benefit to be gained by the death of Ned Doheny, was that due to sympathy for his father, the congressional investigation into the Teapot Dome scandal was called off, and he was forever relieved of having to testify. Despite the best efforts of Leslie T. White in furthering the investigation, it soon became evident that Doheny's millions could in effect shut down further inquiries, which it did within 36 hours of the crime. Leslie T. White continued to work for the District Attorney's Investigation Bureau, but eventually resigned due to the politics that could interfere in an honest investigation. His friend Earl Stanley Gardner, the creator of Perry Mason, advised him to write the detective stories sought by pulp magazine editors. In 1936, he published his memoir, Me Detective, which detailed the corrupt obstacles he faced as he investigated cases for the district attorney. He reviewed several sensational cases, including the crime at Greystone. The book became a bestseller, especially in Los Angeles. In 1936, White met Raymond Chandler at a gathering of the Black Mask's pulp writers. This was a few months before Me Detective was published, and echoes of the Dohenyes were found in Chandler's story, The Big Sleep. The Sternwood family dovetailed the Dohenyes, and he also included a similar estate to Greystone in his story Farewell, My Lovely. He made reference to the murder-suicide scenario in his novel The High Window. The flavor of all the depictions was that wealth could derail investigations and protect the privileged from embarrassing and compromising exposure, including murder. Ed Doheny's millions made the DA bury the truth. 3 years after her husband's death, Lucy Doheny married Lee M. Batson, a Los Angeles financier and stockbroker. They continued to live in Greystone for 26 years, and in 1955 she sold the grounds to Paul Truesdale and sold a mansion to Chicago industrialist Henry Crown, who never lived there and rented it to film studios. Lucy moved to another smaller house that was constructed nearby. She died in 1993 at the age of 100. Later, the city of Beverly Hills bought the Tudor-style estate that included garage, stables, kennels, service building, swimming pool, 2 tennis courts, and English and Italian-style gardens, which cost $3.1 million in 1928 and made it into a city park. This was after Crown planned to demolish the building in order to subdivide it. The American Film Institute occupied the house from 1969 to 1982 at the cost of $1 per year. It was added to the National Register of Historical Places in 1976. Even though the family wanted to move on, the mystery persisted. Unsurprisingly, ghosts are said to haunt the mansion. There are reports of a man in a black suit, and others say it's the spirit of Lucy Doheny who still walks the halls, wafting a trail of lilac-scented perfume behind her. She never spoke publicly about what happened that night in what the newspaper called the Palace of Grief, and perhaps that is why her ghost refuses to rest. The Beverly Hills estate has been featured in numerous films and TV series, recognizable with its distinctive black and white tiled hallway. They include Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte, Ghostbusters 2, Gilmore Girls, MacGyver, The Witches of Eastwick, and There Will Be Blood, which was loosely based on the life of Edward Doheny via the Upton Sinclair book Oil. I think that's very interesting because, well, first of all, this thing about Leslie White, this is a person that's an idealist. He works for the DA. He's an investigator, so his job is to dig up the truth, not one way or the other. And he finds that indeed this guy is so rich, nobody, not the DA, nobody's going to cross him. All right? Like whatever, like this guy was going to throw money at it. So all these people, law enforcement, were not going to, how's this, embarrass the family any further. Because it's obvious, if Plunkett got shot in the back of the head without powder burns, how could he have killed himself? And the one that actually seemed to have a self-inflicted wound was Doheny, not Plunkett. So basically, I think that maybe the district attorney, or unless you go by the idea that it was Lucy, but I don't know, there's something there. I think that they were saying, well, there was really no victim in the sense of whatever happened, we're gonna help save face for the wife, the children, his father. Plus, these people spend a lot of money. What's done is done. And I think that that's whatever the done was. Whether there was some type of gay relationship between the men, or maybe Lucy did discover it and went ballistic. I don't know. It makes you wonder. They had been married. Their oldest child is 14, so they had been married at least 15 years. So who knows what went on there, or what the real gist of it was. And again, it's the only reason why they were renting it out for $1 a year. Later on, after to the that it became a historical place and all that stuff. But the American Film Institute only had to pay $1 because they were hoping that they would help put money towards the upkeep, because this is just like one of those estates, one of the many built by the barons of the Gilded Age, these huge estates, which when they were built, the help was very cheap. So you could have a dozen servants running around, just gardeners. And what happens is that as time goes by, the upkeep of these places, forget repairs, just the upkeep, just in manpower and then, well, whatever, becomes a real strain. So yeah, that everybody that's involved here took it to their grave, unless there's an internal family, like everybody in the family knows, but we'll not talk about it. All right, next story, also out of Stranger Than Fiction Stories, is titled The Guardian of the Necropolis. She's a mystery, and she has kept her secret since her discovery in 1897. A 14-year-old boy found the statue, which is a woman's head, neck, and shoulders, on a private estate at La Agudia in Valencia, Spain. The icon is known as the Lady of Elche. Prior to the arrival of the Romans in the Iberian Peninsula, there were several cultures that settled the land and left their mark. This included the Iberian, Celtic, Greek, Phoenician, the Tartessians, and the Carthaginian. In 1897, a farm worker unearthed a 21-inch bust while he was clearing a plot of land on an estate at La Gudia. The landowner sold the site to Pierre Paris, a French archaeologist. The lady's headdress is reminiscent of Star Wars Padme Amidala in her royal regalia. However, this limestone bust was created in the 4th century BC, and some believe it is older than this. When it was found, it contained traces of red, white, and blue decorative paint, leading to the belief that she was a priestess. The coils on either side of her face are known as rodetes, and once thought to be made of hair, prove they are part of a headdress that covers her head and neck. The composition of the stone reveals excuse me, that it was carved at Alcudia. There are other theories that posit that she is an Atlantean goddess, and that elongated head in her headdress is a type of technological headgear. Here we're getting into the idea of the elongated skulls that you find in other cultures around the world. But let's continue. The opening in the rear of the sculpture indicates she may have been used as a funerary urn, and that she was part of either a seated or standing statue. There's also a theory she is a representation of Tanit, the Iberian goddess of Carthage. The goddess's consort was Balhamin, however she was identified as a virginal goddess with ties to war and fertility. After the fall of Carthage, she continued to be worshipped under the name Juno Callistis in North Africa. Ironically, despite her ties to fertility, Baal and Tanit were given human sacrifices. This continued a tradition started by the Phoenicians, who were the ancestors of the Carthaginians. The religion of Carthage was connected with that of its mother city and is related to that practiced by the Phoenicians and Canaanites. In 1987, relics were shipped to the American Museum of Natural History in New York that were unearthed when Carthage once stood. Present day is a suburb of Tunis on the North African coast. Built on a promontory on the Tunisian coast, it was placed to influence and control ships passing between Sicily and the North African coast as they traversed the Mediterranean Sea. These were beautiful mosaics, bronze figures, jewelry, and more. This was seen as proof of the wealth of the merchant rulers of Carthage. Also included in the collection were cremation urns and religious items used to sacrifice some 20,000 children from about 800 BC until Rome destroyed Carthage in 146 BC. Where Carthage once stood is considered by scholars the largest cemetery of sacrificed humans ever found. The children's bones were first discovered in 1921. Dr. David Soren of the University of Arizona, who spent years organizing the collection, observed that the Carthaginians lived a prosperous and good life, but even the richest among them would give up their son or daughter to the flames of the sacrificial pit to redeem a pledge to the gods. The Greek author Kaitarchos reported, quote, out of reverence for Kronos, the Phoenicians, and especially the Carthaginians, whenever they seek to obtain some great favor, vow one of their children, burning it as a sacrifice to the deity, if they are especially eager to gain success. There stands in their midst a bronze statue of Kronos, its hand extended over a bronze brazier, the flames of which engulf the child. When the flames fall upon the body, the limbs contract, and the open mouth seems almost to be laughing, until the body slips quietly into the brazier. End quote. The grave markers for these sacrificial remains were decorated with a peculiar primitive stick figure that represented this bloodthirsty goddess. Dr. Lawrence E. Stager, professor of Middle Eastern archaeology at Harvard University, said, quote, "Some have argued that those children died natural deaths and that the precinct of Tanit is an ordinary cemetery. But in an ordinary Carthaginian necropolis, one finds normal proportions of both adults and children, some cremated and some not. At the precinct of Tanit, however, there are only cremated children, ranging in age from stillborn fetuses to children 4 years old. There are also bodies of young cremated animals. The charred bones of both children and animals were buried individually in special clay urns with stone markers dedicating them by a special symbol to Tanit, the preeminent Carthaginian goddess, and to Baal-Hamon, of whom Tanit was the consort. The graves in normal cemeteries do not have these dedicatory markers." End quote. In its earliest age, Carthage sacrificed lambs and kids to Baal and Tanit as substitutes for children. Excavations found that in Carthage, children eventually substituted the animals, and in the 3rd century BC, the ratio was 1 animal for every 10 children. A high proportion of sacrificed children seem to have been sourced from the wealthy class that ruled Carthage. The rich parents were anxious to keep their estate whole instead of dividing it among several offspring. Unwanted heirs were given to the cult of Tanit. And by the way, they found that in some of these old cultures where they sacrificed humans, it worked the other way. They would start off with children and then eventually replace them with animals. This was the other way around. They started with animals, and as time went by, the animals became less and the human sacrifices became more. During the Tokugawa period in Japan, child sacrifice was committed for the similar reason. This practice was known as Hitomi Goku or Hitobashira. Feudal Europe instituted the law of primogeniture to make sure an estate would pass on to only one heir. Those who have studied Carthage found that a secondary gain of the sacrifices was population control, since the city had become very crowded as it prospered. The Greek geographer Strabo observed that the capital city had 800,000 at its peak, which might have stretched food and other resources. Another factor affecting the lower production of resources was that farmers abandoned their farms in order to seek opportunity in the big city. In the 3rd century BC, Carthage equaled Roman power, but 38 years after General Hannibal wiped out Roman defenses, Rome conquered and razed Carthage. The Romans forced the Carthaginians to learn Latin and to stop human sacrifices. However, they continued to worship Baal under the guise of the Roman god Saturn. In 2011, archaeologists found a number of Carthaginian temples from the 4th century BC in the Azores, or Terceira Island. They were dedicated to the god Tanit. The archaeologists said, in the first temple, there are 4 sinks linked to conduits to collect fresh water associated with ritual libations, probably for sacrificial purposes. The site where the bust of the Lady of Elche was found is an archaeological site, which has found evidence of an Iberian Punic settlement. Unearthed were Roman houses, walls, and mosaics, with an effigy of Saint Abdon, which belonged to a Christian basilica dating to the 5th century. Within a short amount of time of its discovery, the bust of the Lady of Elche was brought by the Louvre and exhibited there for 40 years. In 1939, due to the dangers of World War II, as a precaution, was taken to the castle of Montauban near Toulouse. It was returned to Spain in 1941 during exchange for other artifacts negotiated with France. In 1948, her image appeared on a 1 peseta banknote, and in 1971 she was transferred to the National Archaeological Museum of Spain, where she is currently exhibited along with other pre-Roman examples of Iberian culture. 4 years before the discovery of the Lady of Elche, another limestone sculpture was unearthed in Alicante, Spain. Depicted as a sphinx with the head of a woman, a body of a winged lion, and the tail of a snake. It dates to the 6th century BC. It's believed it was also part of a necropolis and used to carry the soul of the deceased into the afterlife. The Dama de Basa, or which translates to the Lady of Basa, was discovered on July 22nd, 1971 by Francisco José Precedo Velo in Altiplano de Granada, Spain. She also dates to the 4th century BC and was created by the Bastetani culture. The town of Basa was the site of the Ibero-Roman city of Basti, and one of its two necropolis, the Cerro del Santuario. Made of limestone, she is based on a real Iberian woman of the upper classes. She is seated in an armchair, and her face and hands were painted in skin tones. The cloak and tunic were painted in colors that were really worn, and she holds a blue pigeon in her left hand, a symbol of fertility also associated in the Mediterranean with Astarte and Aphrodite. Like the Lady of Elchit's belief, she was part of a funerary ensemble in a necropolis. The throne on the right is opened, and the cremated ashes of the deceased were deposited in the cavity. The winged and clawed thrones are indicative of a goddess, like the Lady of Galera, who is seated with two sphinxes on either side. The statue presides over other tombs of high characters, possibly members of the same family. Wings on the throne suggest it is a magical vehicle. Currently, the sculpture is housed in the National Archaeological Museum in Madrid, Spain. The chimera Bicha of Palazote and the standing Gran Dama of Oferente, also called Dama del Cerro de los Santos, are exhibited in the same room of the museum. The Lady of Galera is made of alabaster and sits on a sphinx throne holding a bowl full of liquid that poured from her breasts. The statue was probably manufactured by the Phoenicians, but there is Egyptian and Mesopotamian influences. She was eventually buried as a grave could and was discovered in Galera, a town in Granada, Spain called Tutugi. The Iberian necropolis of Tutugi is located nearby in Cerro de Real. Several items found at the site consist of rectangular chambers covered by a circular mound which is reached via a corridor. Grave goods found inside are Phoenician, Greek, and Iberian vases, weapons, furniture, ornaments, and figures made of alabaster and clay. They date from between the 3rd to the 6th century BC. The Lady of Galera is made of alabaster and sits on a sphinx throne. Who do these mysterious ladies represent? Were they the matriarchs of influential families, or necropolis guardians who safeguarded those entombed there, or a representation of a goddess with ties to fertility, war, and human sacrifice? Interesting, huh? Man, those Carthaginians and those Phoenicians, they were something else. So many children. All right, now this story is out of Zero Hedge, and it's titled New Research Sheds Light on Mysterious Origin of Stonehenge's Altar Stone. Geologists may have solved the mystery of the origin of the altar stone central to the ancient monument of Stonehenge on the Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire, England. The altar stone was long believed to have traveled 150 miles from Pressley Hill in southwest Wales with the other megaliths, until later work discounted that theory. According to new research published in the scientific journal Nature, the 6-ton altar stone may have taken a longer journey of 600 miles from northern Scotland. The difficulty of long-distance overland transport of such massive cargo from Scotland, navigating topographic barriers, suggests that it was transported by sea. The study says such routing demonstrates a high level of societal organization with intra-Britain transport during the Neolithic period. According to the study, ancient Britons began construction of Stonehenge as early as 3000 BC and continued for 2 millennia. Stonehenge was constructed with sarsen stones and bluestones, a rock considered exotic to the local area, the study said. The altar stone, the study said, is the largest of the bluestones in the ancient monument. Despite its name, it's unclear whether it was actually used as an altar, he said. And while it now lies flat, with another fallen stone on top of it, it may have once stood upright. Because it is the largest of the stones and central to the structure, researchers have acknowledged its importance. Mr. Howe said, 10,000 years ago, he said, Stonehenge was marked not with stones, but with wooden posts, which suggested that the site had significance for the ancient Britons. Then around 6,000 years ago, a round ditch was constructed, the first signs of the familiar circular structure. He said it's around this time that it's thought that a set of stones known as the Blue Stones arrived at Stonehenge from the Prestley Hills in Wales, a journey of some 150 miles. Hundreds of years later, the over 20-foot sarsen stones were transported to the site and raised to create what is known as Stonehenge today. It's thought that these massive slabs came from quite close by, maybe only 15 miles away, Mr. Howe said. Despite competing theories suggesting the altar stone arrived with either the sarsen or the blue stones, researchers have never reached a definitive conclusion, Mr. Howe said. Last year, a detailed analysis ruled out a Welsh origin for the altar stone, so until now its origin has remained a mystery. The study's co-author, geologist Richard Bevins at Aberystwyth University in Aberystwyth, Wales, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, wasn't allowed to use samples from the altar stones because it's a protected site. Instead, he used a sample from the rock in the 19th century and sent it to Anthony Clark, a PhD student at Curtin University in Perth, Western Australia, where he had the technology to analyze the sample grain by grain. From that chemistry, we could look up the ages and compare them with other source regions in the UK, he said. Using this analysis, he then set about finding a match for the source of the altar stone. Though it's a small island, Britain has a complicated geology. Mr. Clark was able to determine the unique fingerprint of the altar stone and compare it with other sedimentary basins, eventually finding a match in the Arcadian Basin of northeast Scotland. Mr. Clark told Mr. Howe that he intends to conduct further research to find the exact location of northeast Scotland where the altar stone was taken, information which may help illustrate a relationship between the two distant regions. Let me tell you something. I mean, think about it. It's mystery how they moved the stones to begin with. But it goes to show that they went out of their way to source stones. It wasn't only from Wales, from different locations, from Scotland, which leads one to believe that it wasn't just any stone. It had to be certain stones. How they did it, how they transported a 6-ton piece of stone on the water. There's a lot of mysteries there. I think we underestimate the people that were living there at that time, tremendously so. So anyway, I hope you like this January 18, 2025, a little pocket of Eerie news. And never fear, I will be back soon because there's a lot going on. A lot. And most of it is weird.